Hi, everybody. I have with me today Dr. Justin Ram. I'm so excited to have him to talk about COVID-19 response in the Caribbean in terms of the policy response and in terms of the short-term measures versus the longer-term measures that we need. He wrote a magnificent paper that you will be able to find as well on Medium. And I'm here to ask him some questions around the paper itself and to discuss what he's recommended in the paper in terms of what the policy response in the short term and the long term should look like. So Justin, welcome. Happy to have you.
Thank you very much, Marla. It's great to be here. Always great to have a discussion with you about Caribbean matters that are so important to both of our hearts.
Exactly. So Justin, COVID-19 policy responses for the Caribbean. Tell me something in these times when it's like it feels like the world is upside down. And for me, I mean, certainly I feel like it's so difficult for me to concentrate. I applaud you for writing this paper, and just tell me, what motivated you in the first place to write this paper?
Thanks, Marla. I first had the notion of writing this paper when I was actually in some meetings with our policymakers in the Caribbean, and I recognized that they were yearning for some type of ideas or policy responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to that, while this might be a global pandemic, as you and I are acutely aware, over the last 4 years or so, the Caribbean has been going through many crises. And that really relates to the hurricanes. Every time the countries are hit by hurricanes, there's a crisis in the Caribbean. And the problem I saw, Marla, was that every time the Caribbean is in the same place. We are not moving forward. We are not trying to build resilience to the many vulnerabilities that we have. And so I thought, okay, I need to take this opportunity to put my thoughts on paper. About what I think we need to do now within this current crisis. But some of the policy recommendations that I've put forward here are really meant for longer term resilience building. And so I thought that after all of this experience that I have in the Caribbean, it would be useful to share those ideas, not only with policymakers, but also with the wider public, so that everyone in the region can get a sense of what I think we need to do in order to get ourselves out of the current predicament that we are in.
No, I completely agree with you that, it feels as though we're hit with crisis after crisis. And yes, we talk about build back better, but I agree with you that I don't get the sense that truly in a socioeconomic development sense, I don't know that we're really improving. So I'm completely in agreement. And the whole idea of sudden stops, I mean, people are talking about this global sudden stop, and I'm thinking, we are so used to sudden stop in the Caribbean where, you're hit by an earthquake or you're hit by a hurricane and everything stops. But the thing about it is your neighbors, business, they have pretty much business as usual. So they're able to help and contribute to your recovery, whereas now the whole world is on a sudden stop. So that makes it a lot more difficult in terms of the current sudden stop we have as to where we're going to get relief from. But no, you're right. I think really something needs to be said and needs to be done. And so I applaud you for writing the paper. And in your paper, you talk about the economic triage, and then you talk about economic resuscitation and resilience, which is more longer term. Whereas in phase one, economic triage is about, stabilizing the patient, stopping the bleeding. And so tell us, what are your ideas and thoughts around how we, in the shorter term, can help to bring some semblance of stability to the countries in the region in the first place?
Right. So the economic triage is really, those are the policies that are required now while our countries, and not only our countries, while globally we're trying to flatten the health pandemic curve. So there are already two curves here that we have to pay particular attention to. One is, of course, that health pandemic, which seeks to preserve life and certainly to reduce the possibility of overburdening our health systems. So what we are experiencing now with the social distancing or physical distancing terms that we're all very familiar with now,
Yep.
those health policy options are actually mandatory at this point in time. And so I agree with them. But what will tend to happen, as you know, there's going to be this trade-off, because as people stay at home, there's likely to be an economic contraction. And we, of course, here in the Caribbean, for most of the economies that are tourist-oriented, are going to feel that directly and immediately. And so what's likely going to happen is that we're going to have a serious contraction in economic activity. But
Agreed.
it doesn't mean that the depth of that contraction has to be extremely deep. What you have to do now is put in place the mitigants, the mitigating policy measures, to sort of try to keep your economy's heads above the water, or just allow the economy to continue swimming along, whether that is doggy paddling, treading water. Whether that means you have to doggy paddle or do a backstroke. So that's what we have to do. But make no mistake, we are going to have a recession. It's just the depth and length of that recession can be reduced if we put in place some of these economic triage policies, which I have articulated in this paper.
I just want to interrupt you there for a second, Justin, before we talk about the policy measures for the triage. You said that we're likely to be in a recession. Now, of course, there are all these definitions, whether it's 2 quarters of negative growth or 3 quarters. The IMF announced yesterday that we are definitely in a global recession. Last year, we saw global growth at 2.9%, which of course is a recession, because anything less than 3% is a recession. But now the IMF is saying that this year we are in a global recession that can be as bad or worse than the global financial crisis in 08-09. Are you saying, because it certainly is my view, and of course you touched on the tourism sector and how badly that sector is damaged. Are you saying that your view is that we are going to have negative growth for part of this year or for the whole year? What do you anticipate? I know that there are some countries that might differ from others, but on average, do you expect every country in the region to have a contraction this year?
Yes, I certainly expect, certainly over the next quarter, possibly the quarter after that, that our economies are going to contract. There could be a return to growth after that in the final quarter of the year, but I don't think that growth is going to be sufficient to overcome the huge contraction that we're likely to face in the next 2 quarters. So when you annualize that, I think over this year, we're likely to see negative growth rates.
I agree.
But that, of course, now how much we contract on an annualized basis really depends on these mitigating policies that we put in place. Yes? It
depends on the mitigating policies largely, which you will go to now, but it also depends on the condition that the economy was in before. So if you think about Barbados, for example, that is now coming out of the recession that it was in, and there is the adjustment program there. If you think about Trinidad, that has not seen really any growth for the past 10 years, versus economies that were growing, like the Dominican Republic, like Guyana, like Cayman. I think it depends on where we started from, but I think it's fair to say that everybody is going to see significantly reduced growth, and in most cases negative growth this year. So I just wanted to make sure and put that on the table so that everybody understands exactly the magnitude of what we're dealing with. So now tell us about some of these short-term measures.
Yes, so certainly in the short term, I have tried to put all of these measures into different categories. So the first set of measures, of course, has to do with the healthcare system. That is critical because at this point in time, we all have to be concerned with the preservation of life and trying to protect the integrity of our health systems. That means that governments will have to provide the necessary resources to our health sector, both financial as well as manpower. or human power, as it were. That means, we have to get a number of health professionals, the ratio of health professionals to possible patients. We need to ensure that that does not go in the wrong direction, that we are maintaining a good ratio. We have to also ensure that they're well resourced. As you can see from the media, ventilators are such an important piece of equipment. And
Even
also
masks.
PPEs.
There aren't enough masks.
Yes.
Exactly. PPEs, there's not enough to go around. It's scary.
Exactly. So these are really important. And so that's why I have put that at the top of my list, health system support. And in addition, within health system support, I have said that we need to ensure that people who need to get healthcare can get that healthcare without tipping them into poverty, let's say, because let's suppose your country does not provide you with universal health coverage, and you have to pay for some of that yourself. That health coverage at this point in time is really important, so it doesn't leave you in a state of huge indebtedness. So I think that governments need to come forward and provide some amount of health insurance if the national health system does not provide that. Yes, and within that as well, Marla, I think that there's a real opportunity similar to what we are seeing in the US and in Europe, whereby perhaps some of our domestic manufacturers in the Caribbean could start thinking about manufacturing some of these things. Because as you could imagine, there's a mad rush around the world to procure a lot of these items. I'm not sure where we would be on the list to get those items. And so it's really important that we also consider how we start to manufacture some of these. Can we repurpose our manufacturing facilities to do some of this?
The only thing I've seen in the region is Angostura has started making hand sanitizer instead of alcohol for consumption. So, but I don't know of any other manufacturers in the region that have shifted. But certainly internationally, I've seen car manufacturers, for example, switch to making ventilators. I've seen clothing manufacturers switch to making masks and gowns and so on. So there is some of that happening globally, but I don't know regionally how much that has taken up.
Yes, and I think the making of masks and of course the other PPE equipment, I think we do have manufacturers in the region who could switch to doing that quite easily. The ventilators one, that probably is a little bit more of a challenge, but who knows? I always like to boast that our region, we have some of the best minds here.
Of course.
And I'm sure that if these persons had the right incentives, they could get into the manufacturing of those types of equipment as well. So after health system support, I go into social system support. Because Marla, as you and I, we are both economists, and I always reflect on what Arthur Lewis said about this notion of economics, that is really about the study of how people live, the conditions under which human beings live. And so as we go through this crisis, we have to pay particular attention to the most vulnerable in our society,
of course,
who are likely, as always in any crisis, to be impacted the worst. And so whatever policies we're thinking about, we have to have targeted interventions to support them at this time, so that persons who are maybe just at the edge above the poverty line, that this crisis does not take them below the poverty line. And that targeted intervention, I think, is really useful at this point in time, because I want to come back and discuss that later on when we speak about economic resuscitation, because sometimes we often think that to support the economy, we have to do a blanket support. Really what's required is a targeted intervention.
You're right.
And so that is what those set of interventions are meant to look at.
I just want to interrupt you there, Justin. Under your section of social system support, you talk about policies that account for gender imbalances. And I just want to spend a little time there, because we know that women are disproportionately affected in any crisis. And already women are, poorer and socially and economically disadvantaged in this, but not just in this region. So tell me, in your, what in your head were you thinking in terms of direct or targeted policies that you think in a time like this, or at any time, not just in a time of crisis, that we need to pay particular attention to ensure that we promote gender equality?
Sure. I'm really happy you raised that, Marla, because this is why I think it's so important to have targeted interventions. And of course, I understand the constraints that we have in the region around data and statistics, but we can discuss that later on when we speak about resilience building. Mm-hmm. But let's take, for example, a female-headed household, and she has to take care of, let's say, three children, as opposed to a male-headed household, let's say, and he's perhaps living on his own. It would be very unfair if, for example, both of those individuals were receiving the same compensation if they were in the same types of jobs, because the responsibility of the female-headed household is a lot different, and she would have certainly a much more in terms of financial outgoings than the male person. Now, of course, this can be reversed as well. So when we say gender, it can be. But this is why it's important to have targeted interventions, because the first household, the former household, can quite easily be tipped into poverty if you are simply providing everyone with the same level of support. And so that's why I'm really focused on this whole notion of targeted interventions, because you have to take into account the idiosyncrasies of different types of households across the different income bands. So that's what that sort of just gives you a quick example of what I am considering. There are other examples that I could use as well, but that just really tries to provide you with a sense as to why we need to ensure that we have the right data and understand how to target households differently.
Good. And I agree. Thanks for including that.
Yes, no problem. So fiscal and financial prudence, I think that this is really important for us. Often,
Indeed.
We can look at the international media and see how many more advanced economies are providing assistance to their economies, but we have some constraints here. I haven't spoken about the need to have foreign exchange reserves as an anchor, but in this section, the fiscal and financial prudence really refers to the fact that we could have regional governments that are in a position this year that they need to roll over their debt. So could you imagine trying to provide a fiscal stimulus in this time, while at the same time you have to roll over debt? As you know, many creditors around the world are seeking cash at this time. They want liquidity, and they may not be in a position to simply say, okay, I'm going to roll over this debt, because most of these creditors might have investors who want cash, because cash is the biggest insurance that you could have right now. And so there may not be that appetite to roll over debt. And so these are things that we have to be mindful of when we're thinking about how much we can stimulate our economies. The reason for putting that here is really for us to consider the broader implications for us, because as you know, Marla, we simply can't go out and print money.
Some of us marginal do, but we ought not to.
Yes, we ought not to. But the reason for that is because, as you know, the marginal propensity to import here, to consume imports, is so high that if we were to print money, that's simply just going to be frittered away by importing stuff, and we're not going to see the effects of that. But if you have on top of that these rollover risks, then you have to pay particular attention to that. So I thought that it was important to include that as well. And then I go into labor market support. This, I think, is really important. As we flatten the curve, we know that, unfortunately, some employees are going to be laid off. And there's only so much that employers can keep paying their staff while no income is coming in. And the best example of that is in...
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think I've seen almost every country in this region come out with some sort of support for for labor market and for people who've lost jobs. So it looks like they're doing well in this region on this part.
Yes, that's quite, yeah. And of course, the amount that they can do will depend on how long this crisis continues. Yes. And so what's likely to happen is that persons would get some compensation, probably not all of the income that they were accustomed to, but at least enough income so that they can afford to purchase the necessities of life at this time. And then I go into private sector support, because ultimately we don't want firms that were at least doing well to simply go under because of this crisis. And there are a number of ways that governments can consider supporting them, either one through direct interventions or providing guarantees for loans from financial intermediaries. And I think what's also going to be required in the section after this is where I speak about the financial support, the financial sector support, where it's also important that we speak to the financial intermediaries at this time to tell them, could you provide moratorium on payments, not only for the private sector firms, but also maybe to individuals who have loans with them. But of course, that has to be done in a way that you don't want to have a crisis on your financial sector afterwards. So it has to be done within financial ratio guidelines. Yes?
No,
I've spoken to that as well.
Yeah, and I have seen most countries, the banking sector, come out and talk about providing relaxed repayment terms, basically, whether moratoriums on principal and interest or extensions of debt, the repayment terms and so on. But one of the things that I cautioned somebody I was talking to about this, that we saw when I was in the still in the banking sector, we saw a situation where there was a country that was organizing a mortgage relief program. And what happened when the government announced that they're going to do this mortgage relief program was very interesting, in that the people it was designed to target were those who were struggling with their mortgage payments because the country was in a recession. But what happened was everybody stopped paying their mortgages, even those who did not have a problem making their mortgage payments before. And so that's the other challenge that the banking sector faces, not just that their balance sheets can be affected by this and their profit, and of course their profit, but also when you extend these kinds of relief or relaxed repayment terms to those who genuinely need it, there's a challenge that you can face where it ends up you end up being affected by even more people than you anticipated, and people who didn't suffer any loss in earnings, but they're seeing it. So it's a whole moral hazard kind of situation where they see other people benefiting. And I just hope that people behave responsibly. That's what really it boils down to. That unless you are affected and you can show evidence that you're affected, and the bank can then work with you on a rescheduled repayment terms, for example, everybody needs to do their part and be responsible for their financial obligations.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right, and I've included that in this section where I've spoken about the moral hazards, risks that are involved. I probably don't expand on it, but I just put in there that we have to be mindful that there could be moral hazard risks, and that's exactly what you have just said. So that's really critical. I think in any policy that governments or even private sector are considering, those are important risks. But Marla, if governments or anyone is thinking about policies in the correct way, these should be natural things that they are considering as well. So good policy analysis is really critical at this time. Yes.
True.
And then, so after that, I speak about this supply side balance of payment support, because I think here, Marla, we as a region, we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to increase something that I think is dear to your heart when you speak about fiscal multipliers. I know that you have been on a mission, I would say, over the last year to really educate our policymakers about how important it is to understand the size of our fiscal multipliers. And you are fully aware that when we do these things, a lot of it goes into imports, and so we don't get the true effects of it. And so while we consider doing this, if we as a region can think about measures that would also lead to import substitution, I think would be useful. In that way, we would be able to have more purchases domestically. And here domestically, I really want to refer to the Caribbean as one economic space.
Regionally, then, yes.
Yes, regionally. So if we have more of that, then it's likely we can improve our fiscal multipliers, and therefore, if we have more purchases regionally, then that would work well.
I agree with you, and I just want to touch on that whole idea of the regional response and implications and the opportunity that this presents. And I think it's important to talk about that, because I have had a lot of people say to me, and I've witnessed people saying on social media and so on, if we had food security, if we had energy security, if we had all of these things, then we wouldn't have to be so worried in a time of crisis like this. Now, that is so true, except that these small islands, to what extent can you reasonably expect to have food security? Maybe energy security, as we shift more towards renewables, you can have much more of that. But really, if you go back to what the West Indies Federation really was, one of the things that they stood for was that whole regional approach to food security, and that you have certain countries like Guyana and Belize and Jamaica and so on being our bread baskets and providing much of what we eat. To me, now is the time where we can recognize just how much of an opportunity that could be if we can come together as a region. And because what it might mean, Justin, is that an importer who can get avocados from Mexico at, let's say, $5 a pound landed here in Barbados might have to pay $6 a pound landed here in Barbados if you're importing it from Belize instead, or if you're importing it from Jamaica instead. And so it's, sometimes all of us have to take cognizance and also make some sacrifices for a greater good and a greater goal, which is we want to support regional integration, but we want to support our own regional economies. And so perhaps we need to relook at what our motivations and incentives are, and look at, if we have a regional approach to this, and it means that perhaps we might need to, in initial phases at least, support a producer who is not as cost efficient as a Chinese manufacturer or producer or farmer, versus one from Belize, one from Jamaica, one from Guyana or Suriname, for example. And this requires, as economists, we're taught about, what is your competitive advantage? And if that's what you're good at, then that's what you should focus on. And we should not be supporting those who are less efficient. But I feel like there is an opportunity to think about relaxing some of these mindsets that we have around those things, to think about, if we look at the greater good, and in terms of what are the labor market implications of that, the socioeconomic implications of supporting a regional approach. Tell me, what are your thoughts on that?
I fully agree with you, and let me expand on some of the things that you've just said. So the common external tariff that CARICOM has is really meant to try to do that, if you think about it. So if we have avocados being produced in Belize at $6, I don't know, at a pound or kilogram, versus what you could get from Mexico at $5, then the CET is really meant to try to protect that, so that the Belizean farmers can have access and full access to the regional market, and that then becomes their natural. And then what will tend to happen, as they are able to produce more for the regional market, they're going to have economies of scale, and eventually also come down to $5. So it's just a matter of time. But let me also add to this, Marla, that why it's important for us to have free movement of labor and free movement of capital. Because although Belize might, as a country, have a geographical and certainly land advantage in terms of producing avocados, there's no reason why a farmer from St. Vincent or a farmer from Barbados should not be allowed to go there and to purchase and to purchase land, let's say, and to start doing avocado farming as well.
Right.
Now, in addition to that, you might also have capital in Jamaica or Trinidad that should be allowed to go there and invest easily, because capital should be allowed to move to where you can get the highest rates of return. And if in agriculture, that means it has to go to Belize or Guyana, so be it. And if that means that if I want to be a farmer, let's say I'm a Trinidadian and I want to be in farming, then I should be allowed to go to work, let's say in Belize or Guyana, and to do my farming there, because that's where the best comparative advantage is for the region. So that's also an important aspect of this regional movement, and why the free movement of labor and capital is so critical for the success of that as well. So really, it's an opportunity for us to build on these things. And all I can say here, Marla, is that while we're in the crisis, let's hope that we don't do what we did at Cricket World Cup, when we had, for example, people were able to come into one port and then they were able to travel around the region freely, and then we went back to what we had before. And so there was a sunset clause on that. Now is the time for us to push forward from these things that we've been advocating for so long, and certainly to maintain and to sustain that into the long term. And of course, we will talk about that later on as well.
I agree. So now we're going to talk about doing an assessment of the damage, right, onto the patient. So we've stabilized the patient, we've stopped the blood from flowing. Now we have to see how badly this patient is damaged.
Yes, and Marla, this is a critical assessment that is required, because you cannot then simply go and start prescribing drugs or medicine to a patient until you have done a proper diagnosis. So we have stabilized, we have said, okay, we have kept the patient on life support, the patient is going to survive. Now, what's the real problem that has happened? Now, Marla, here's where the assessment is really critical, and here's where you need your analysts, not only in the public sector, but also maybe from financial institutions, from the private sector, to look at the problem and say, okay, here are the structural scars that have been left as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. But as you so correctly said at the beginning of this video conference, on top of these new scars, we were already in a place where we had challenges. So now we are layering these challenges on top of what we had. And so it's important now to say, okay, we have these new challenges. We had challenges before. How do we prioritize which of these we are going to tackle first? We have a number of things which we need to do, but of course we need to be able to prioritize. And so from that, you start to say, okay, this is how we resuscitate the patient, so that the patient can get back up and running again. To use those terms. So perhaps I should use the terms moving from a doggy paddle into maybe a breaststroke now. How do we get the patient to start doing that? And so that is why this assessment is so critical. And I have to make a plea here that evidence-based policy making is critical. And we have to be able to assess options based on proper assessments. It can't be simply looking up at the ceiling and saying, okay, this is the best. We have to do the analysis. And that takes a bit of time, but in the long term, it will work out for the best for all of us.
I agree, because we do sometimes see governments implement some policies and you're not quite sure where they came from with that, if it's politically motivated, if it's motivated by copycatting. But yes, I completely agree with you. We need to have the evidence as to why we're implementing any policy, and at any time, whether now or when we're not in a crisis. So once we've done the evidence-based assessment and we know we have the data, we've done the analysis, and we know what the structural scars are, pre-existing scars as well as new scars from COVID-19, then we can move into phase 2 around economic resuscitation and resilience building. So talk to us about your thoughts on that.
Yes, so this is really I guess a compilation of some presentations and papers that I've been doing over the last few years, whereby I think we have been speaking about it, as you know, and you have been speaking about it as well, the need for us to build resilience.
Of course.
And I think that that has to be our mantra going forward. It comes back to the earlier point that I made, that every time a crisis comes up, and crises seem to be coming up much more frequently now for us, we are finding ourselves in the same place. And we keep saying we need to build resilience, and now is the time to do that. And so there's actually a figure within the paper, which I have, the figure 5, which is the resuscitation and resilience policy reforms.
I love it.
I just tried to summarize what I think we need to do there on macroeconomics. I know that you're a huge believer on the need for us to run our fiscal houses in a prudent way. Ideally, Marla, I think we need to be running fiscal surpluses so that we're saving for a rainy day.
That's completely agree with you.
That's just the nature of the neighborhood that we live in, that we need to have savings in place. And one of the ways to do that, Marla, I think, is that we have to improve the productivity and competitiveness so that our private sector becomes the engine of growth and starts to do a lot of the things that governments are currently trying to do. And once that happens, it means that governments will now be able to save more. The private sector will be blossoming, perhaps paying even more tax revenues.
Taxes, exactly.
You know, so this whole thing has a real virtuous circle. Yes, yes. So if we look at it from that point of view, everyone can benefit from this. In the productivity and competitiveness, it's quite funny that I was hearing only yesterday that in some of our countries, banks are now allowing you to take a photo of a check and send that to them, and they will deposit that into your account. And I'm thinking, wow, this is. I'm so happy it's happening, and I hope it maintains.
Only now.
Only now. But I've hinted about the need for us to consider fintech as being so important for us, and of course that move to digitalization. Human development, which is the bottom left-hand corner of that chart. Although we've made such great progress since independence, in terms of education, so many of our people still live in poverty, and we have high levels of unemployment. And I think that while we look at building resilience, we have to ensure that we have equality of opportunity. Because it doesn't make sense that you have your private sector being competitive and you don't have people being able to take advantage of those competitiveness opportunities. And so really investing in education and getting people out of poverty is so critical at this point in time. And I speak about some of those things. And then environmental preparedness, I don't think I have to say anything about that. We all know that the type of neighborhood we live in. And then that's all focused on sustainable society. And then at the bottom of that chart, Marla, I speak about some cross-cutting themes which are really critical for us. The regional integration, I think, is critical. We can't do a lot of this unless we come together. The gender equality for me is absolute priority, and we've spoken about that. Although I've given just a really one example, I think that in everything that we do, and if we were to do proper gender budgeting, if governments were to do their assessments, we could spend our money a lot better. And by targeting more interventions, we can have better outcomes. Statistics, Marla, I cannot plead enough about why we need
story of our lives.
Story of our lives. To allow us to do that evidence-based assessment, we need data. Digitalization, I think, is key. And then the final one there is we know we have an implementation gap. And so I speak about that later on in the paper, why it's important for us to think about implementation. But before I get there, I think it's important for us to understand that we're going to need resources to do a lot of this resilience building. And it's time for us to start thinking innovatively about getting resources. We're going to need the help of the international community, no doubt. This is where the international financial institutions come in, like the IMF, the IDB, the CDB, the World Bank, our bilateral partners, that is to say our main trading partners. But Marla, I think that this is an opportunity for us to think about how we could utilize liquidity in our banking system to help us to help us build our own resilience. And I put forward an idea here about democratizing investments. And I think this is where fintech can play a role. If we can have the right type of fintech platforms that allow governments to raise resources. Now, these resources can be raised domestically and internationally, but I think if we had a focus on domestic resource raising, we can have the ordinary investor investing, let's say, $100, buying a bond, let's say, and trading that on a fintech platform quite easily. I'm just putting forward these ideas, but there are people who are a lot brighter than me who can figure this out.
There are people working on this. There are people working on this where it's almost like you're crowdfunding a big infrastructure project.
Exactly. So
I completely agree with you that we have so much liquidity in the banking system that people just park in their accounts because they're not sure what to do with it, or they're not sufficiently investment savvy, or they're just lazy, unaware, whatever. And I feel like that liquidity can be much better utilized. And I agree with you that you can't rely only on external, especially now. I mean, yes, we're seeing the IMF said that they got 80 countries come to them for support. We know that the World Bank has given support, like in Grenada, for example, and St. Lucia, they announced some packages recently. But at a time like this, the whole world is looking to them to get some relief.
Yes.
And so perhaps that pool might be shrinking. And so we need to also look within as to what we have available to us. And you're quite right. The domestic banking system in many countries is awash with liquidity. And you already see, Carry Lend, for example, and other platforms that allow people to put small amounts to lend to somebody else or to finance. NGOs do crowdfunding in this region. And so it's about scaling that up, right? Because we seem to have a culture developing of that. And perhaps we need somebody to champion scaling this up. And maybe if a particular government were to decide to be the first one to put their toes into this pond and say, I need to build whatever, whether it's a physical piece of infrastructure, or whether it's a policy intervention, and I'm looking for crowdfunding, and you have the same terms and conditions as you would for a typical bond, we might see that kind of takeoff. It really needs to start with one.
Yes, and you're right. It just has to start with one, and the insurance companies can play a role in this as well, as you could imagine, as being some type of underwriter, or even insuring some of the payments if there was a problem. But I also want to say that, coming back to that virtuous circle, here is where governments also have a responsibility, because if we're now considering this sort of democratizing of investments, where we're getting the ordinary person to invest in our own resilience building, then governments have to understand this is why they must practice fiscal prudence.
Of course, because if we don't trust that you're going to do the right thing with our money, we wouldn't give you 1 cent. We already have to pay taxes, and we're not sure sometimes what you're doing with the tax money.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. So this is why it's such a virtuous circle, Marla, that if everyone is on the same page, we can find that we can be moving to a much better place in the Caribbean. And by doing so, we're likely to grow the pie. And by democratizing investment, it means that as these economies grow, these ordinary investors would also be sharing in that, because now they're getting returns on this investment from their own savings. So and could you imagine that provides even a greater incentive to save more, which as you know in basic economics, savings rate is so important to economic growth. And so it's this virtuous circle of constantly getting the incentives in the right places. It's the right carrots at the right time, I think. Yeah. So that's what that was about.
I agree. So Justin, let's talk about the big elephant in the room everywhere in the Caribbean, which is implementation. So, I think is it CARICOM that, or who was it that coined that term implementation deficit. And it feels like that characterizes this region.
Yes.
You know, it's so sad.
Yes, and I see it in every country.
Yeah.
Many governments have the best will in the world to try to implement good policies, but it just doesn't happen. In fact, our implementation rates are quite low. If you look at public sector investment programs, it's not a surprise to you, but to many people it might be a surprise to see how low the implementation rates. It's perhaps even as low as 7% in some of our countries, and that's not good. And so that's why I've put forward here many of these policies that perhaps I have articulated here. Many have heard of them before, but really where the rubber hits the road is, can we implement them?
Agreed.
And so we have to consider a new framework of implementation. And that really means this sort of 8 steps to delivery that I've highlighted here.
Yep.
And by no means I am not the one who has come up with this methodology. This has been articulated by Michael Barber out of the United Kingdom when he was in the first in the world where Tony Blair had set up a performance management and delivery unit in the Prime Minister's office, and Michael Barber was heading that, and he wrote a paper on deliverology. But then, as you know,
deliverology, I like it.
Yes, and then, as you know, others take your ideas and then perfect it. And I should say the Malaysians, under the stewardship of Idris Jala of Malaysia, who is, I think, one of the most brilliant minds in the world, who managed to take that idea of deliverology and turn it into this 8-step process. And let me just go through the 8-step process with you. The first step is prioritization, Marla. That's really critical. And what tends to happen is that unless you don't set out priorities, everything becomes a priority and nothing gets done, as you are aware. And so it's really important to get, I think, your cabinet in the room and to say to them, okay, here is what we want to do. Let's say, what are the top 5 or top 10 things that we should be doing? And Marla, why that is so important is that not everyone in that room would have their ministry as a priority. Yes?
Yeah.
And so it's important to understand why it is that I am asking the Attorney General to provide resources to this priority rather than to that. So everybody needs to be on the same page. Now, I've said that at the cabinet level, but countries can consider doing that even at a whole government level, which includes the opposition as well, right?
Right.
So that can be done. And in fact, there's a project in St. Lucia now, which started off by doing this, where the cabinet went on a retreat for a day, and they were able to come up with 6 key priority areas that government would focus on. And after doing that, Marla, the government of St. Lucia recognized how important this methodology could be for them, and they decided to implement this 8 steps to delivery. And let me just go through the other steps with you.
Congratulations to them. Well done.
Yes, and leadership is so important in this, Marla. I can't reiterate that. I can't reiterate that. Yes. After you come up with your priorities, you then go into planning labs, where you have to say, okay, I have to take my best people in society, wherever they might be, public sector, private sector, non-governmental organizations, academia, and put them in a room and maybe lock them in there for a few weeks. Now I say lock them up. Now in Malaysia, they actually put them in a room for 2 months. And where they had to work on implementation plans for each of those priority areas. Now, this is where this is how proper policy making works. You have to put the time in at the beginning to get the good results at the end. And then after you come out with those implementation plans, you then have an open day where you come to the population and say, okay, here's what we've said we're going to do with timelines. Here's how we're going to implement it. Please give us your feedback. And you know why you need to have that open day, Marla? Because the population needs to be on board with this. Everyone
there
needs to
needs to be
understand.
buy-in. I
There
mean,
needs to be
otherwise you
buy-in.
won't have buy-in. Exactly, exactly.
Yes. And it's important that you have buy-in across the population, but across the political lines as well. Across
Right.
that floor of parliament. It's really important that everybody is on board.
Exactly. And I just want to just add there, and the reason why it's important to have the opposition on board is because so many times we see in the region where when there's a change in government, then it's like you press a reset knob and everything gets wiped off
Yes.
and you start all over again. And that's just wasting time. And of course, it doesn't achieve the results that you intended. Even the best laid plans get wiped out of the agenda because it was the other parties. So yeah, making this bipartisan is to me a really critical element.
Yes, and that's critical because we all need to be on the same page. What's our
Hmm.
vision for our countries and our region? We know that this is where we are heading. At the end of the
Hmm.
day, by 2030, this is where we should be. By
Right.
2035, this is where we should be. Or even
Yeah.
by 2022, this is where we should be. And this is how we know that we're all working towards the same objective.
Hmm.
And that, of course, means that you then put out your roadmaps.
Hmm.
So, of course, with your proper KPI targets and all that, anyone who has worked in the private sector is aware that this is how the private sector works. You have to have your KPI targets. If you're not achieving them, you know in advance why you're not achieving them, and you sort of change course, because this has to always be iterative, because as you go along, you're going to learn things that you would not have thought about before. It doesn't mean that you were wrong. You were just using the best information available at the time. But it's
Hmm.
important to be able to change course quickly.
Indeed.
What we tend to have in the Caribbean, Marla, sometimes is a sort of a continuation bias, whereby sometimes we all know, why are we continuing along this path when it's not going to achieve the type of outcome, but we seem to be unwilling to change course. So that
Yeah.
sort of mindset has to happen, whereby I think with KPI targets and with regular intervals where we keep checking on these targets, we're able to say, okay, no, we need to change course because we're not on the path that we thought that we would be. And
Hmm.
then a relentless focus on implementation, Marla. And this is where I think setting up a performance management and delivery unit in the office of the head of government is critical. Now, why I say
Right.
head of government, because as you know, in the Caribbean, some heads of governments are prime ministers and some are presidents.
Hmm.
Doesn't matter. You
Doesn't
need to
matter.
set up this office that reports directly to the head of government and reports to the head of government on a weekly basis about how we are performing on achieving these stated priority outcomes that we have identified in the first phase of this 8 steps to delivery.
I have a question, Justin. So you're saying that this implementation unit that's in the office of the head of government, that implementation unit is responsible for the actual tasks of implementation, or they're responsible for the overseeing and monitoring and evaluation and reporting of the implementation that is taking place in whichever respective ministry and so on.
Right. So it's the latter. So they're not
Okay.
directly responsible for the implementation. So let's
Okay.
say, for example, one of the goals was to have a balanced budget or to have a fiscal surplus in 5 years' time.
Right.
It would be your Ministry of Finance that would be the
Right.
implementing agency for that.
Right.
Now, the Ministry of Finance can't do that on its own. It would have to coordinate with all of the ministries. It would have to coordinate with the private sector. What the
Hmm.
performance management and delivery unit does is to help that coordination,
Right.
to sort of look for ways of overcoming any sort of bottlenecks, to provide analysis that would help overcome any challenges. Because this is where I need to also say that the people who are in your performance management and delivery unit must be very well aware of how to do proper analysis, and must be the type of individuals who are willing to collaborate and to get over problems, to
Right.
identify problems, but to be able to, how do you overcome these problems? And
Problem solving mentality and attitude, right?
exactly.
Hmm. Hmm.
Exactly. And I should say that those individuals don't necessarily have to come from within the public sector. They should
Right.
be able to come from anywhere within society.
Right.
And of course, governments will have to think about the compensation mechanisms for that, because you want to attract the best people to perform in the PMDU. So that's critical there. And then they are meant to assist the Prime Minister or the head of government by providing reports on a weekly basis to the Prime Minister or to the President about how the implementation of these priorities are coming along. Now, the regular reporting is critical because you don't want it to stay too long before if there's a challenge popping up and the head of government is unaware of it.
Right. But I have another question. So let's just say we go in with your same example of having a fiscal surplus in 5 years. And the implementation unit is reporting every week to the Prime Minister or the President, as the case may be, on how progress is being made towards that goal. But I just want to be clear that the accountability for achieving it rests still with the Ministry of Finance, or does that accountability, so okay, it rests with the executing agency, which in this case is the Ministry of Finance. Right.
Exactly. And let me give you an example of how it worked, for example, in Malaysia. So the Prime Minister might request that while he or she is receiving an update on the progress on a weekly basis, that the person with overall accountability for that key deliverable, and it could be your Minister of Finance, also is there at the meeting at the same time.
Right.
Now, in Malaysia, there was a joke that sometimes there might be an outstanding item that isn't being implemented. But the day before the Prime Minister calls the meeting for that accountability, all of a sudden it gets implemented. So
you see so what accountability can do. It's magical. It's magical.
Exactly. And in fact, Idris Jala did give me a great example of there was a minister with responsibility for public utilities and the electrification of Malaysia, so to provide electricity to rural areas. Okay. And that minister made a bold statement that in a year's time, certain rural areas would have 100% electricity. Now, Idris Jala was the head of the PMDU in Malaysia at the time, Pemandu, and he called the minister. He said, are you crazy? You're not going to be able to achieve this, and you're going to be in big problems. But he said, you know, what happened is that minister focused on that with a laser focus.
Right.
And it happened. Because there was this great level of accountability, which pushed that minister to achieve this, because they understood that, you know, egg could be on your face if you said that you were going to do something and you did not achieve it. So you're right, the whole new level of accountability is what is critical here. And then, of course, I think on a yearly basis, we need to be reporting back to the population. We could be doing this on a quarterly basis, but it's also important that we have an external audit that says that, okay, the government is saying this, but we've done an audit and that has been verified as true, or it has been verified as untrue, you know, so. And
I agree that you need that independent verification so that there is, you know, that level of transparency that the government can't hide and pretend that they're doing something that really they're not. And I want to highlight, if you let me, the example of Jamaica and what their Economic Policy Oversight Committee does. And I feel like that might be, you will know better than me, that might be perhaps it might resemble that kind of process where you have these targets and then you report to the people. I think it's done quarterly in Jamaica, that the EPOC comes out publicly and says, you know, we had targeted these few measures, this is what we have achieved, this is what we didn't, and this is why. And I feel like that is so important, because people, first of all, you lift the whole population to a level of understanding as to how their economy is being managed and why. And then you drive accountability publicly, because like you said, nobody wants to have egg on their face and wants to be named and shamed. And the private sector, it's a really very broad-based committee that involves the private sector, the NGOs, the academia, and so on, that really helps to drive wider understanding, transparency, and accountability. And I feel like that's an example that has really worked well in Jamaica, and perhaps every country in this region needs an epoch, I feel. And it speaks
Yes.
very clearly to what you've identified in these 8 steps to delivery here.
Yes, and that's right. I think you are correct that the epoch is a good example of how of this. Probably some steps they have not undertaken, and it can be refined. But certainly what I've seen the St. Lucia government doing is very closely aligned. And in fact, in St. Lucia, what they have managed to do now with the COVID-19 crisis is that while the performance management and delivery unit was focused on the six key areas for them, it's now focused on implementing the response to COVID-19. And so
they've shifted their focus completely.
They shifted their focus completely now to assist with that. And that means, for example, getting their main hospital up and running and well-resourced. Things that they were doing before, but now even greater focus. So that's how it is. And to be able to shift focus in times of crisis is also quite important. Now, the final step in this 8-step process, Marla, is this annual report.
Yeah.
Because really, I think every government comes at the budget time and says they're going to do this over the next year. But we also need to have an annual report that goes along with that.
Yep.
And I think that here is where how it's reported. Governments, I think, need to become a lot more savvy in the way they communicate. I think there are some people in society that love to read long reports. You know, Marla, you might be one of those. You might, I know you might.
No, I don't love it. I do it because I have to. But sometimes you read budgets, and I kid you not, it's a carbon copy of last year's, which suggests that nothing really was done. You know.
Exactly. But there are people who, like you and I, we have to do that of our living. We go through these reports. But then there are other people in society that just want to have an executive summary. And so the reporting will have to be that. And then there are some people who are not going to read at all. And maybe you should have a video which shows you, okay, what has been done. So communication is an important part of this, and governments need to understand how to do that properly.
Yes.
So if I say on January 2nd, this is what I'm going to achieve this year, I should be able to come back to the population with a properly well documented report in those 3 types of formats and say, okay, this is what I've done. Yeah, if I've achieved, if I have not achieved, then this is what I'm going to do in the next 12 months to ensure that it is achieved or within a shorter period of time. So, Marla, I think it all comes down to accountability.
Of course, accountability is huge. Now, I just want to focus a little bit on that point about communication. And you are so right. And forgive me for my obsession with the Jamaican example, but I feel like their central bank, their EPOC, and their ECG, the Economic Growth Council, Economic Growth Council, have done a tremendous job, certainly regional, if not global benchmark with respect to how you communicate with people, what your policy agenda is, and what you've achieved. I mean, the central bank, the Bank of Jamaica is now world renowned because of their communication strategy. And I feel like the rest of us need to pay attention to this. And you know what else I wanted to add to this, Justin, is, we talk about institutional quality in this region, and that the quality of our institutions determine so much of our social and economic outcomes. This that you're talking about here, this delivery unit, is an institution. It is a new institution that we need to have in this region, in every government, that specifically is geared towards implementation and accountability. And I feel like we need to recognize it as such, as an independent institution and a necessary institution, just as necessary as the tax board and the central bank. I feel like this is an institution every country should have, and we need to figure out how do you get each country to adopt this type of an institution.
Yes, and you're right. And the thing about it is, Marla, because it's a new institution and others have done it successfully before. And both of these individuals who I've spoken about, Sir Michael Barber out of the UK and Idris Jala, they have told me personally, and of course they have helped in St. Lucia to set up their performance management and delivery unit. We actually had consultants from both of their firms helping St. Lucia to set this up. And they have said they really want to assist our governments were doing something similar. In fact, in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, both were in contact with me about, Justin, we would be happy to run cabinet prioritization sessions with every government in the region so that they can understand how to prioritize now. And I think if we were able to do that first step, Marla, most of our governments would see the very usefulness of this methodology, as well as the importance of setting up this new institution as you're speaking about. It's absolutely critical. This is what we need at this time, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are others out there who are willing to help us, and I think we can just simply call on them now, and they would come to our assistance to help us set this up.
So Justin, you have homework. So you have to set up this remote conference call between these guys and all the regional heads, and help them to set up this communication so that they can understand what it entails and start to get work going in this direction. You have plenty of homework.
Plenty homework, Marla. And back in 2017, I actually did a presentation to the heads of government at the CARICOM heads of government meeting, where I set out this methodology for them. And at that meeting, they all agreed that this was useful. But it was only one country that set out to do it, and that has been St. Lucia. And I think that besides me doing the homework, I think it would be very useful if they were to speak with the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, who could certainly attest to the benefits that this has had for the proper functioning of his government. So yes, I have more homework. But there's also great testimony that our heads of government can receive from one of their own counterparts. But I think this is a way that we need to go into, and I'm happy to do that homework.
Good, and maybe you and I have a takeaway, a little piece of homework here. Maybe we need to do a session like this with Prime Minister Shastane to get him to tell us how it's working. And then we make sure that he sends it to each of his peers in the region. So yeah, maybe we can do something like that. But I really feel like I feel like that institution that drives implementation and accountability, Justin, will make all the difference, even for the smallest and most insignificant of policies, all the way straight through to the most transformative of policies. We need that kind of implementation effort and accountability. And I want to thank you and congratulate you on including that in this report. That's what I really fell in love with in this report, that implementation part, because we can debate as economists, and we can debate as policymakers what are the correct policies at what point in time. That's all well and good, and whether it's evidence-based or whether it's not. But the point is, if you don't have an implemenation unit, it ain't happening. The chances of it happening are very slim. And so it almost feels to me like we have to work backwards. We have to reverse engineer from the implementation, to the point of deciding which policy based on the priorities. We really need to get that implementation unit going in this region. And I applaud you for including that element in this paper and for the whole paper, which is very, very critical, I think, for everybody to read, especially the policymakers at this point in time.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I think this implementation is critical because we simply don't do the proper assessments to understand why a good policy could fail. If we were to do that, I think that's where this performance management and delivery unit can help, because it's really some of implementing the mitigating policies while you're doing good policy work is what will bring success. Getting over those challenges. Why is it, for example, you might have certain people in society who may not want these policies because it's going to impact them negatively. And so you have to think about how you go about perhaps compensating losers, because at the end of the day, in any policy, there's going to be winners and losers. And you have to think about how you bring everyone along. And that's why this PMDU is so critical to help you overcome challenges, so that you don't have, as we always see in the Caribbean, many good policy carcasses along the roadway, and
Oh
that I think is what we need to overcome.
Indeed, indeed. So Justin, again, I thank you. This is a very important piece of work that you've done, and I congratulate you. Of course, I'm going to do my best to make sure that everybody gets to see this, and I look forward to seeing the fruits of your labor and your homework in terms of getting, these implementation units set up throughout the region. I mean, St. Lucia certainly is an example that we would like to hear about, and perhaps we can organize a follow-up webinar or video with Prime Minister Shastane to talk about this. And it's something that everybody needs to hear, because I can't imagine that there's anybody who, having been exposed to this and seeing what it can do, will not be in support of it. So I congratulate you. I thank you. I think this is something everybody needs to see in the region.
Okay. Well, Marla, I want to thank you so much for this opportunity to share my thoughts, certainly on this paper. I'll be happy for us to have that discussion with PM Chastane of St. Lucia, who incidentally has already indicated to me that he would love to provide testimony on how good it is.
Oh, wow.
In fact, I should say that he has said that this is the best project that St. Lucia has ever implemented. That's how important he sees that PMDU. And I should say that I'm going to be writing a few more papers. I have a paper on resilience impact bonds, which is really about how you finance resilience building, which I would hopefully publish soon, and I certainly will be getting that to you. But Marla, I want to also say to you that you are such a great advocate for the Caribbean region. I love the work that you do, and I'm so privileged that you have taken the time to interview me this morning for this. Thank you so much.
Justin. We're in this together. We have to make this place a better place for our children, right?
Yes, indeed.
We want them here. We want to stay here, and we want them here too. So
yes, you are so right.
We have to do our best for them and for everybody in this region to make this a better place. And I thank you for your support as well. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, Marla. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.